Hi, this is Nick from PrimeLoops.com. Today I want to tell you about compression, specifically what the purpose of compression is and how it works through its parameters. I have two different kinds of sounds loaded up that we can try out some compression on. One of them is a drum beat that I've put together, and the other one is sort of a plucked guitar line. Let's start out with compression on drums first, because this is usually where people begin to learn about the process. I've put together a little drum beat here, using individual hits from our Minimal and Tech House drum sample pack. First I'll demo it for you without compression. It's a simple but effective beat, but I think it could benefit from some compression, so let's add some now. I'll right click on the drum machine here, go to Create, and then Comp 01 Compressor. Now this is the basic compressor in Reason, and it's got all the essential controls that you would find on most compressors. And since this is a concise guide tutorial, all the knowledge that I give you here can be directly applied to any other compressor that you might use. So I like to look at compression as a three-part workflow. Part 1 is the threshold, Part 2 is the ratio, and Part 3 is the envelope section, which is made up of attack and release. So what does compression do? It's basically a way to take an audio signal and shape it in a specific way, increasing the volume of certain sounds as well as squashing the volume of other sounds. It's a nice way to tame some of the peaks in your material, but it's also easy to overdo, crushing the dynamics and thus some of the life out of your music. So the process on a basic level is that audio goes in, the compressor reacts to the volume changes in the audio, increasing volume at places and decreasing the volume at other places, and then spitting out the result. And the way it does this is by processing the audio using these various parameters here. So the first of the three parts in the compressor is the threshold control. Threshold simply determines at what level the compressor will actually start to act upon the audio. Any incoming audio that's underneath the threshold setting will not be affected by the compressor and will pass through unaltered. Any audio at or above the threshold setting will actually be compressed. So the next question is, assuming that the audio has gone over the threshold setting, how much will it be compressed? Well, that's part 2 in the process, the ratio control. Ratio determines how much compression will be applied once the audio goes over the threshold. It's expressed by two numbers separated by a colon. And like any ratio, it just means that the result is being divided in some way. For instance, if I have ratio set to 4:1, all the audio that's actually compressed will be reduced 4 times. That is, it will be 1/4 the volume going out as it was going in. If I set it to 16:1, then all the compressed audio will be cut down to 1/16 of its original level. So basically, the higher the ratio control is set, the more compression is happening. The last question to ask about the compressor is how the compression takes place over time. So far we know that the audio has gone over the threshold, and thus it's going to be compressed. We know how much we want to compress it based on the ratio setting, but now we need to tell the compressor how we want it to compress audio over time, and that's what attack and release are for. Attack is the amount of time that it takes the compressor to go from no compression to the full compression amount, however that may be defined by ratio. Release determines the amount of time that it takes to go from full compression back to no compression at all. So let's go back over this 3-step process one more time before we actually try it out on some material here. Audio comes in, it meets the threshold control. If it's not up to the threshold, it passes through unaffected. If it's at or above the threshold, it's going to be compressed. Next, the ratio control determines how much compression will occur, and then attack and release determine how the compression is applied over time. So let's try this out on some drums and you can hear what I'm talking about. Now when you want to start figuring out what compression settings will work best for your drums or any other material for that matter, you want to start with some reasonable settings on the compressor. The first thing you'll always want to determine is the threshold, that is, at what point the compressor will start acting on the audio. So when I play back the audio through the compressor, I'm going to keep bringing the threshold control down more and more until I hear it start to affect the audio, and that's where I know I need to leave the threshold for now. I'll set the ratio up fairly high so that when the compression does kick in, it'll be fairly obvious, and I'll set the envelope to medium settings, again so that the compression makes itself obvious. So now I'll play the drums back and bring the threshold slowly down until I hear the compressor start to affect the audio. And indeed, I could hear some of those peaks being manipulated a little bit by the compressor at this threshold setting right here. Now we can go and manipulate the other controls until we get a good sound, and I can always come back and change the threshold to something more suitable later on. The next thing I want to do is set the envelope settings. I like to do both of these at the same time while I'm running some audio through the compressor. A shorter attack time means the compressor will kick in more quickly, and a shorter release time means the compressor will disengage itself more quickly. So if you have a short attack and a short release, you'll hear the compressor start to turn on and off more rapidly while you're playing audio through it. This is what's known as pumping, and sometimes it's a good effect, sometimes it's a bad thing, depending on what kind of sound you're going for. I'll set up some pumping compression settings and you can hear what I mean. As you could hear there, the short release time is really the key to a pumping compression. Also, you probably noticed that I brought the threshold way down, and as you know, the effect that a low threshold setting has is to take more of the audio that's coming in and compress it. When you combine the settings of fairly extreme compression through the ratio setting, a low threshold setting, which means most of the audio is getting compressed and very little of it is passing through unaffected, and a very quick envelope release time like this, you'll start to hear some really hard pumping effects on your drums. I'll set up some more subtle compression settings just so you can compare it with this pumping sound here. As you could hear, the compression got a lot less extreme and started to make itself far more transparent in the sound. I'll go ahead and bypass the compressor and you can listen to the drums unaffected, and then I'll turn it back on, and you can hear the subtle improvement that it gives to the sound. As you could hear when I turned the compressor on, it took some of the sounds that were a little too loud in the mix, brought them down in volume to match up with some of the other sounds. And the overall effect was that the compressor started to glue the drum sounds together a lot better. And indeed, this is one of the greatest uses of compression, is to take various sounds and glue them together by reining in their levels a little bit and allowing them to play better with one another. So now let's move on to a different piece of material, a little guitar loop here. I'll just go ahead and unfold this Dr. Rex player. Again, I'll let you hear this uncompressed first. So now I'll add a compressor onto this and you can hear some of the benefits that compression can add to a little string sample like this. So knowing what we know now about how a compressor works, let's try to predict how these default compression settings will work on this sample. First, the threshold setting is set fairly low, so a lot of the audio is going to get compressed as long as the incoming levels are pretty consistent into the compressor. The next step is the ratio setting, which is about halfway up. So there will definitely be some audible compression happening on the material that does get compressed. The attack setting is somewhat fast, so the compression will kick in fairly quickly. And since the release time is set halfway up, the compression will actually fade out over time. And in this way it will actually emphasize the sustained period of some of these hits in the sample. Here's what it sounds like without compression. And with compression. So as you can hear, much like the drum sounds, you can do a lot with shaping the attack phase of some of these sounds just by how you have your envelope set up as well as how low you have your threshold set. If I take my attack setting and set it far higher, it will only start to affect the release time of the sounds rather than the beginning attack portion. Another issue here is that some of that release time actually sounds sort of unnatural, and one big reason for that is that the compression is fading out a little bit too quickly. So if I increase this release time quite a bit, maybe we can fix some of those issues. And that certainly sounds far more natural than it did before with the shorter release time. With melodic material like this, and even more so with pad sounds and other kinds of sounds that have very long attack times that fade in gradually over time, compressors are most often used to shape the release time, or the fade out of the sound. And the reason for that is if a sound fades out at too high of a level over time, it will start to clash with some of the other sounds that are trying to compete with it in the mix. The time when you want to compress drums is when they're getting a little out of hand in terms of how the sounds are interacting and stacking up, and so you want to compress down some of the loud peaks in the material, and also reshape the drums a little bit to sound stronger and louder in the mix. So that about does it for the introductory discussion of compression. Although this academic discussion of compression can be helpful, it's best to try out these techniques on your own as well. Start out with some very subtle compression settings that add a little bit of polish to your sound, and when you get more comfortable with what the controls are doing, then you can move on to using it more as a special effect. I'll see you next time for more music production tips and tricks. Stay creative.